We're very fortunate to have Paul with us this morning because Paul spent many years as a close disciple and personal aide to Dr. King. He's one of a handful of people, including Brian Kneep, who lived with and cared for our master for many years. So Paul's perspective is of one who closely observed and studied the ways of a true master 24 hours a day. And many times he was up 24 hours a day, I might add. So let's think about that just for a second. I mean, let's think about how fortunate we are to have an individual who spent that much time with a true yogi, a true master. Can you imagine listening to a similar class given by a direct disciple of Jesus or Buddha or Ramakrishna? I mean, it's really an amazing opportunity. So I'm personally very excited to hear about Paul's insights. And one of the traits of a yogi is keen powers of observation. So we're going to see how well Paul's mastered this yogic trait. Paul also is an international director of the Aetherius Society. He joined the society in 1986. Paul grew up in the Christian tradition and spent time studying Eastern philosophy at the London School of Economic Science, which I personally don't get.
I can give you half an hour on that.
As well, Paul spent 2 periods at Findhorn, you see, a New Age spiritual community in the north of Scotland. And Paul is very active in interfaith efforts and a board member of the Southern California Committee for the Parliament of the World's Religions. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Paul to start this event. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Reverend Paul Nugent.
Well, thank you very much, Rodney. The only thing that I would like to clarify, just sort of being you having the yogi precision, is that yes, I was very privileged and honored to be a personal assistant to our master, but I wouldn't say necessarily for several years. It was a few years in the latter part of his life. I think altogether, well, in Santa Barbara, it was about 3.5 years. I went to Santa Barbara for a weekend, and I stayed for 3.5 years, if you really want to know. Anyway, while in Santa Barbara, of course, we had many experiences. I remember one in particular when I had rushed through our master's living room where he tended to sit during the day. And about 10 seconds, I rushed through into the kitchen. Brian might remember this. And the master followed me about 10 seconds later. And he said, "Why are you rushing?" He said, "There's no rush. There's only God's time, which is now. And it's all happened anyway." Which was just, completely remarkable. I'm so glad I rushed, because if I hadn't rushed, we never would have had that little piece of that insight and that bit of wisdom from our master. But I think the reason that I bring that up is because in the true and real sense, and I'd say this was the case with our master, and I'd say it would have to be the case with every yoga master, is that they live literally in the now. They are in the now. And I think for all of us who did know our master, whenever one went before him, one was totally in his presence, which was just a remarkable experience. And I'm sure that is the same for all great yogis. The other thing I would just say is a little bit of preamble, and I know I only have half an hour. But I remember reading several years ago someone describing a yogi, and they described it in a rather strange way, but they said, "What do you get when you squeeze an orange?" I think I heard that somewhere. Very, very good. You get orange juice. You get orange juice. And what they were trying to say is that you always get the same thing. You always get that essence, that same essence from a yoga master. And I think that was absolutely the case with our master. And the reason that I'm saying that is because how I've chosen to share my perspective on what it means to be a yogi is I've divided it into 10 separate points. But really it's quite difficult to differentiate. And the way I would describe it is it's actually like a cake, like a chocolate cake or something, a cake. that has been divided into 10 separate slices. But you're all going to get you're going to get the same cake. You can't separate one aspect of a yoga master from another aspect because it defines who they are. It's the essence of their whole being. And anyway, the first point I would make, and I'd make this of every great yoga master, be it the Buddha, Jesus, whoever they may be, and certainly true of our master, Dr. George King, is that they are completely focused on a single goal. This is the first hallmark of a yogi, completely focused on a single goal. And in the case of the masters I've referred to, and particularly our own master, that is to know God. That's the first fundamental of a yogi, to know God. And the way it's wonderfully sort of described is as if your hair is on fire and you're rushing to find water to put it out. Nothing else matters. I mean, if my hair was on fire right now and you were wanting me to give a talk, I'm going to the bathroom. I need to put my hair out. I don't have time to have a conversation. And one is absolutely, totally fixed or fixated on knowing God, on understanding what it is, who I am, what it all is. And that, I'd say, is the first fundamental of a yogi. And all of these points, because, you know, in terms of what is a yogi, well, are we talking about a yoga master? Or are we talking about ourselves as yogi aspirants? And even we might even think of ourselves as yogis. And I think really all of these points, all of the points that I'm choosing to share with you today, are relevant, at least I hope they're relevant, to every single one of us. They apply to every single one of us. There's nothing different in the ultimate sense about a yoga master and ourselves. They have exactly the same potential, or we have exactly the same potential as they have. They've just realized that potential. And anyway, that is the first, I would say, fundamental hallmark of a yogi. Complete single-mindedness to know God. The second point I'd have is a yogi is completely dedicated to serving God. Once they've found God, then their whole life becomes one of serving that God, because one knows that there is no separation. In fact, that even defines the word yoga, a Sanskrit word which literally means union or union with God. And so one sees that one comes into the present moment, and particularly on this planet, one sees the plight of us unrealized yogis. And in our master's case, I think for all of us who are familiar with our master's life, and I'm certainly not going to go into it in any real detail, but from that moment, from 1954, when he was first contacted by the Master Aetherius with the great statement, you are to prepare yourself, you are to become the voice of interplanetary parliament, even though he didn't understand it. But the rest of his life, and I can say, as can Brian and as can Richard and all of us who were close to our master, that this stayed with him right up to his dying last breath. His whole entire life was devoted and dedicated to serving humanity. I don't really have time to go into the great missions which he devised and the way he did that. That certainly can be and is another aspect of karma yoga. But just sort of thinking of myself, I'm getting embarrassed, but I am going to be 60 this year. I don't know why I'm getting embarrassed about that, but sometimes what I do is I think, well, what was our master doing at the same age? What was he doing when he was my age? And our master, he had just, well, to be precise, he was, I would say, primarily working on Plan B, of Operation Sunbeam, how to expand Operation Sunbeam, the greatest service mission ever given to mankind. But it was still the original way of doing it, Plan A. We didn't even have Operation Space Magic. With the Saturn mission had not even been conceived. He was still completely, totally dynamic and engaged in ways to help the world. Just one other very brief thing I'll mention, just because it's somewhat relevant, and I hope I can squeeze it in. But one thing I do remember, when I did first go to Santa Barbara, I was 35, and I remember May the 8th, 1994, thinking, this is the age our master was. He was my age when he received the command. And I remember having this thought as I was standing at the kitchen sink, just looking out at the window, thinking about that. And in the distance, I could see 2 palm trees. I still, every time I go to Santa Barbara, I look out of that window and I see those 2 palm trees. They're a lot taller now. But it was striking. And just on that, very, very briefly, but this is one book that I totally recommend. It is actually referenced in the 9 Freedoms. Cosmic Consciousness by Richard Morris Buck. And he describes all the people he feels had become yoga. Yoga being attaining that state of samadhic consciousness. I recommend the book. Let's leave it at that. But the point being that all of these yoga masters, this is something that comes out of his research. Interestingly, not ironically, but interestingly, they all attained cosmic consciousness at roughly the same age, which was about 35 years of age. It's when our master received the command. If you think of the master Jesus, and I'm not sure about his precise death, but it would fit in. And likewise the Lord Buddha. They were all roughly of that similar age. That's enough of number 2. Third point, a yogi has great intensity. Nothing that a master does is half-hearted. If they're going to do it half-hearted, you might as well not do it. And this was just to give one or 2 examples, but one of them is prayer. If you're going to pray, give it everything you've got. Give it everything you've got. I mean, sometimes you would hear him on some of the addresses that we listen to on a Sunday, and he'd come in and he would sort of scoff or mourn how he just heard the congregation deliver the prayer. Whatever it was, if you're going to cut grass, cut it right. Don't sort of wander all over the place with a lawnmower. Nice, straight lines. Pay attention. Pay attention to everything that you're doing. One of the things that our master said is that nothing can be achieved without enthusiasm. He loved enthusiasm. He loved enthusiasm. And by the same token, he loathed disinterest. A yogi does not have disinterest. They're focused and fixed and have this tremendous passion and intensity and enthusiasm for everything they do. And just one of the things that our master would often say, and it's a very good thing indeed to be reminded of. But he says, he would say, if you had my kind of interest, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't leave that cup there or you wouldn't leave that piece of trash on the ground. If you had my kind of interest, which was absolute, you would do it. And it's a very important lesson for all of us. Third one, which Rodney touched on, is a yogi is very precise. Is very precise. They're very exact. Very exact about everything they do, coming back to cutting the grass. Examples are relevant to our master, but I mean, one of them was making a cup of tea. There was an exact way of making his tea. It was a strange way of making his tea. It wasn't pretty, because he'd have cold water in it. It had to be just the right temperature. You'd have to put cold water in it. And just so much sugar and just the right amount of cream. And if it wasn't, you'd upset him. And I mean, even it's just small things. Karen, I'm sure, will remember from doing a lot of this kind of work, but folding a letter. There's a right and a wrong way of folding something as small as folding a letter. But he would want it folded exactly right. And heaven help you if you put the label on squint. You know, a label goes on, there's a right way of doing everything. And it's true. It's true. Being precise, and we can all learn this. We can all apply this. Give it everything you've got and do it right. Number 5. Doing well here. And number 5, I actually combined this one because I wanted to get something else in. So I've made this the same one. And that is that a yogi is 100% dedicated. 100% dedicated and has great faith. And not only would I say that a yoga master, it's certainly true of our master, and I think, but they have great physical strength, but even far greater way, they have unbeatable mental strength, and absolute, as I say, 100% dedication. And just for example, and I think it's a very good example, imagine if you, or I, but imagine if you received the command, prepare yourself, you are to become the voice of interplanetary parliament. Back in the 1950s, when nobody had heard about interplanetary parliament, when there were attacks on his life. But look, 60 years on, at what has been created, what has come about from one man, from a yogi, receiving that initial command. The whole worldwide international Aetherius Society in all of its multifaceted ways, because he had absolute faith in the origin of that statement, the truth of that statement, the profundity of that statement, the greatness of that statement, and nothing knocked him off that course. And I think, what if I'd received that? I mean, I would probably go to my friend and say, wow, you wouldn't believe what I heard this morning when I was washing my dishes. You know, geez, man. It was huge. It was huge. But he had absolute great faith. And I think that, again, we don't have time to go into it, but for those of us who do and for those who don't know about Operation Carmelite, you can find out about it. But I mean, he had the faith and the dedication, literally, from the wonderful song, to march into hell for a heavenly cause. He had that dedication and faith. Nothing. In fact, I remember one thing the Master said, which was a classic. Master didn't like to. One of the things he didn't like was water. I mean, I love water. I love going for a swim. I love the ocean. But I remember him saying to me once, he said, if I had to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea, I'd take the devil. And I think he's about the only person who could say that, or would say that. But we know his motto. It's right here on his altar, choose well, stand fast, know God. I think if he hadn't chosen that, I think he would have chosen the love of God never fails as his motto, because that's how he lived his life. And it ran through everything he did in his service to humanity. 6, a yogi, and Rodney, this is one, you picked up on this one as well, Rodney. And I think actually this is the one that I wanted to add in. Number 6, a yogi is very attentive. It's very attentive. A yogi notices literally everything. They see everything. You don't get away with anything with a yoga master. You just don't. And this was not just sort of, I mean, if people want examples, but we used to print Cosmic Voice regularly. Every month there'd be an issue of Cosmic Voice. And the master would, or everything that was printed, he would want to see a proof. And he would spot stuff in there that everybody else had missed. He picked up on absolutely everything. But this wasn't just a sort of a physical attribute of being so present, of having this intensity, of being so committed to his cause. It also, and brought about, but it was very closely aligned to psychic ability. There was a psychic attentiveness, which really he needed to have, knowing who he was, as has been announced, so I can say it again, but as adept number one, he needed to have his psychic abilities very acute. But I remember it as much more sort of light-hearted and wonderful way. Again in Santa Barbara, Brian, I'm sure will remember this as well. Brian was something of a student, dare I say, of Vivekananda, had the complete works of Vivekananda, a really thick book. We spent a lot of time sitting in our master's kitchen, so I would dabble in this book from time to time. And you may know that Vivekananda was a yoga master, and he had his own master, who was Ramakrishna. And I remember asking Brian and Richard one evening as we were sitting in the kitchen, I said, if Vivekananda was in your room, Brian's room, and Ramakrishna was in Lady Monique's room, which one would you go and see? And I have to say here and now, I won't say what their answer was. I didn't agree with either of them. And I don't think the master they would have gone to have seen would have agreed with them either, but we'll leave that there. But anyway, then sort of 10 minutes later, the beeper rang, master's beeper. And I presumed he wanted a cup of tea or something like that. So I went to go and see him. And he looked up and he said, "I'm the master you want to come and see." There's no way he'd physically heard that conversation, but it just, an aspect of his psychic attentiveness. Number 7. A yogi is detached. Have to be. A yogi has to be detached. It's a difficult, I think it's probably the most difficult one for us to follow as aspiring yogis. You may know, it's quite interesting, and I think it defines the authenticity of our master as a yogi. Because when he received the command and began his mission, he gave up everything that he owned. He either sold it or he gave it away, because he left himself just with the clothes that he wore. He gave up everything, and that I understand was essential for any true yoga master. All attachment gone. It's an instruction. Gone. So he gave up literally that attachment to possession. Of course, as his life went on, we all need things, but our master wasn't particularly attached to any of them. He could do away with, and one of the best examples, it's not monetary, but in terms of the ability to detach, and again, Brian will remember this. Our master, probably from, like some of us, from his teenage years, was a smoker. Our master smoked just about for all of his life, I would imagine. I mean, he was in the 40s, people smoked in the 40s. And he was in his 70s. Now, he was, I mean, probably by today's standards, he was a heavy smoker. We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that, master. You were a heavy smoker. But his doctor told him he had to give up. He gave up. He gave up just like that. To my knowledge, I mean, for those of us who have given up smoking, we complain about it, we go on about it, we crave cigarettes. with our master? No. It's done. It's over. Finished. And another way, and I think this is an important way in which he needed to detach, people left him. People left him. People who he loved left him. And he remained fixed. He remained focused. He detached. Your choice. You're free to go. So detachment in many different facets is a very essential key aspect of a yogi. Number 8. I don't know how we're doing for time. A yogi has tremendous magnetism. And I think this is one of the things that we miss most of all, those of us who knew the master, and for those who didn't know our master. Because if our master was here on this property right now, even though he would almost certainly be next door, we'd know it. We'd know it. If the master was here on this property, some people would say you'd know it when he was in Los Angeles. He had this tremendous radiance, this aura, that in a way, only in a way, ran both ways. Because nothing was greater, just more precious than being in our master's company, and where it's a good exchange, where he's enjoying your company, where you're pleasing. There was nothing better. There was nothing better than that kind of exchange with the master. But by the very same token, there was nothing worse, and I'll be polite here, but upsetting him. You just did not want to because you felt awful. You felt awful for days. It could go on for days, depending on the severity of the situation. You just felt so bad. Such was his tremendous persona, magnetism, aura, beingness. Most of the time, I would say that he kept his magnetism very, very, very contained. Very contained. But again, just one example, personal example. Experience one time in Santa Barbara, I remember it well, we'll never forget it. I was on duty that night. Rodney was quite right. A lot of this stuff was almost 24 hours. I think the latest we ever put the master to bed was about 3 a.m. We'd started 11 or 10:30, 11 putting him to bed, and I think we went on, took us nearly 5 hours just to actually get him into bed and stay there. And once he was, you wanted to tiptoe out and just go to your room and close the door. Anyway, I was on duty this particular night, and I heard the master's bed creaking upwards. He had one of these electric beds that you could tilt the mattress, and I could hear it, and I was just waiting for the buzzer to go, and it hasn't gone yet. What's happening? And then, even more strange, I heard him going into the bathroom without beeping. I mean, the master never would get up out of bed and go in the bathroom without having you be there, or outside, obviously. So I was curious, and I'd opened my door. I was sort of peering at him, I could see him down the end of the corridor as I heard this bed. Went in the bath, and I shut my door because, if he'd wanted me, he would have called me. And then I heard him coming out of the bathroom. I was now lying on top of the bed. I used to sleep in what was Lady Monique's bedroom. And the master came down the corridor in the house, and I could feel, this is in terms of his yogi's magnetism, here where the guard was down. Because as he approached me, I became absolutely paralyzed. And as he continued walking by, the paralysis wore off. And then he turned around, and again I could feel this paralysis. And when he was exactly opposite, I was completely paralyzed. wore off, and he did this back and forth up and down the corridor 3 times. So that is just, you know, as I say, I think, well, not I think, but the Master kept his true light, or that magnetism, under relative wraps, or under complete wraps, virtually. Very occasional. I'm imagining he was in contact with one of the masters, and you stay there, boy, and I'm going to make sure you stay there, you know. But that a yoga master has great magnetism. Number 9, just 2 to go. A yogi is also very balanced. I mean, you're getting, I hope you're getting, you know, a picture of the intensity and the magnitude of a yoga master, and that is their fundamental being. But our master knew how to relax. He knew how to have his downtime. In fact, he really would define the term work hard, play hard. For those of you who are observant in the yogi fashion, you've probably been noticing a little sort of pile of sand that's been building up outside the door of the 3rd bungalow. Have you seen that sand? Where is this sand coming from? Well, the sand was put in the door, I'm presuming by Charles and Al many years ago, probably during Operation Carmelite, to keep the sound down from the parties that they were having in what is now the George King Center. They had fun in there. They made a noise in there. He had his own band, the Supersonics. He nothing he enjoyed more than a fancy dress party where he would come as Colonel Bloodnock, I believe was his name, with a great big moustache as a detective, Colonel Bloodnock. He had cafe discotheque. Some of the fondest stories of Master are told when he is traveling, or sort of, you know, going on a destination, and when he'll stop and go to a restaurant or something, and he enjoyed himself, and everybody around him had a fantastic, totally memorable time. So in that sense, yes, the same intensity. We're partying. Have a drink. Have a drink. I mentioned he smoked. He did, yeah. In part to keep the vibration down, but also in part to relax. A yogi is pretty relaxed when it's time to relax, and yet in a moment they can be razor sharp at the same time. The last of these points that I've written down, number 10, is a yogi is unfailing. A yogi is unfailing. They never give up. I mentioned people left. Nobody is ever forsaken. A yogi does not hold a grudge. They remain absolutely true, absolutely steadfast, absolutely loyal, completely reliable, totally trustworthy, to which extent you will never have a better friend. And even for those who didn't know our Master, that definitely applies. If you go out of your way to follow this path in these ways, with intensity, with faith, with dedication, with enthusiasm, with an enjoyment, you will know our Master. And as a great yogi, he will never, and that means never, forsake you. Lastly, I just wrote 2 other things down. Basically as afterthoughts. I think this. I even put the great secret. The great secret. These are my words. At least I'm sure somebody else has said them or thought of them, but the great secret is everything is yoga. Everything is yoga. Every aspect of our life is yoga. And in the true sense it is, because this union, this oneness, which yoga means, is there even though we're not aware of it. But everything we do, everything we speak, everything we think, how we speak, how we think, how we act, everything is yoga. And we can either do good yoga, we can do so-so yoga, or we can even do bad yoga. And the final thing, which I just wrote down, is a yogi gets it. A yogi gets it.